Welcome, everyone. I hope you're doing well. Thank you for joining us this evening. I will briefly introduce the webinar before letting our chair for today introducing then the speakers. So first of all, welcome. As you know, this is a webinar that is co-sponsored by different institutions, mainly the Wolf Institute, that is also hosting the platform through which we deliver these webinars, and obviously the Society for the Medieval Mediterranean. Alongside the University of Exeter, the University of Lincoln, and the IMF CSIC. So one important thing that I wanted to say, obviously, is a brief introduction about the Society for the Medieval Mediterranean, that, as you know, not just sponsors this webinar, but is also linked, is a society that covers the academic study of the Mediterranean from the 5th to the 15th century, and as you know, is also linked to the journal Al-Masak. Miriam normally has got the journal to show, and I normally have it too, but I have to say that I just landed. I arrived in Sicily today, so I couldn't carry Al-Masak with me. But the journal is there, and obviously, if you sign up and become a member of the society, you will receive the journal issues, which you're more than welcome, obviously, to do, and we recommend you to do. So the format of the webinar, as you know, is the usual in the sense that we have. So it will be recorded and it's going to be also broadcast live on Facebook. The recording lasts for exact an hour, so obviously we can't keep it going for longer. However, if there are further questions or anything that might take a little bit longer, we could do that. Just it's not going to be recorded, but that means that everything has to be on time. So today, as I said, the chair for today is Gregory Lippiet, who's our colleague from Exeter, who's also coordinating the webinars this academic year, and is going to introduce our speaker. Well, I'm naming our speaker because I still can't see online if the second speaker has actually managed to log in. Don't think so, which means in the end it's going to be a one-man show. So we look forward to hearing more about Fabrizio Ansani's research from Exeter as well. So I leave now the space to Gregory, and thank you.
Thanks very much, Antonella. Welcome, everyone. Thanks very much for coming this evening. We're really looking forward to Fabrizio's talk. The session we have for today was originally titled Steel and Horseflesh. We may just be getting the horseflesh side of things, it looks like, but we're delighted to have Dr. Fabrizio Ansani with us. Fabrizio is, as Antonella said, my colleague at the University of Exeter, where he is a British Academy Newton International Fellow, working with Professor Maria Fusaro, who's also on the call, I think. Fabrizio's got a great career of looking at war and economy and military resources. He's had postdoctoral fellowships at the Istituto Italiano per gli Studi Storici. He's worked at the University of Padua, and he's been investigating in the past trade around saltpeter in the 15th century, so obviously ingredients for the production of gunpowder. But he's also written on other aspects of early modern warfare and the economy of war that surrounds it. He's published in journals such as Technology and Culture, the European History Quarterly, and Business History, which he's most recently published in, examining Lorenzo de' Medici's role as a military entrepreneur and the formation of a contractor state in Renaissance Florence. And this evening, we're delighted to hear Fabrizio talk to us about horse dealers and diplomatic agents, Italian cavalcatori in the late medieval Mediterranean. So without any further ado, Fabrizio, take it away.
Thank you very much, Gregory, for this presentation, and many thanks, of course, to the Society for having me today. So I'm trying to share my presentation. So in the late 15th century, the horse farms owned by the Marquises of Mantua were considered some of the best in the entire continent, as several grandiose stables hosted hundreds of bellicose destriers, rapid racers, and elegant amblers. To establish such a reputation, the most interesting and most promising specimens were acquired in Tunisia and Egypt, from Andalusia to Anatolia, mares, stallions, foals that were imported to develop an effective state breeding program. The result of such incessant effort was the establishment of farms that crossbred Turcoman, Arab, and Berber horses and Spanish genets as well, producing present mounts that were particularly sought after by other Italian rulers. Nevertheless, the purchases of luxurious, exotic thoroughbreds was not only a reflection of the social ambition and the political prestige of the House of Gonzaga. On the contrary, the entire plan was aimed at supplying the family-owned mercenary company with war horses. Indeed, the procurement of destriers represented a significant challenge for the Marquises, given the absolute importance of the military contracts signed at the time with the Duchy of Milan or the Republic of Venice, pacts of political subjection and diplomatic alliance, upon which both Mantuan independence and seigneurial finances substantially depended. No expense was spared in acquiring the animals apt to combat. A large number of horse dealers, the so-called cavalcatori, was sent in the Middle East, in the Iberian Peninsula, and in southern Italy to procure those equines that were considered to be the best war horses of the time. Other buyers explored city markets and regional fairs in France, in Denmark, in Burgundy. The quest for excellent destriers also led them to visit the stables of aristocrats, cardinals, and courtiers, where valuable mounts could certainly be found. Of course, these horses had to be functional to the improvement of Mantuan breeds. Although they retained a certain autonomy of judgment, the brokers were not completely free to choose this or that specimen, as they had to strictly respect the Marquise's instruction regarding the size of the steeds, the color of the coat, or the characteristics of the gait, or the degree of training of the foals. The envoys had also to remain within budget, although a greater expense was widely tolerated if made to satisfy the tastes of the lord. While abroad, finding information on horses and their owners, on breeding farms, and on best bargains was thus essential to maximize available time and potentially save money. Specific news could be gathered by courtiers and ambassadors, but information was particularly accessible through Italian merchants located in Mediterranean ports and European cities. Indeed, businessmen were well informed about market trends and supply consistency, and thus capable of providing useful suggestions on the optimal timing for purchasing a specimen during a horse fair, for example. Moreover, Mantuan cavalcatori consistently and heavily relied on Florentine, Genoese, and Venetian entrepreneurs to prepare their missions, as they depended on bankers to exchange money and secure all the loans necessary for buying animals, for paying duties, or for chartering ships. A crucial support was also provided by the friends and the correspondents of Mantuan marquises, Spanish aristocrats, Italian ambassadors, and Ottoman officers whom the cavalcatori typically encountered during their travels. In general, horse dealers cultivated a strong relation with this influential individual, thus expanding the significant and vibrant patronage network of their lords and contributing to its sustainability. In fact, assisting Mantuan envoys often led to receiving valuable gifts, cash payments, or even benefits and appointments at the court of the Gonzagas. Collectively, these high-ranking supporters proved particularly useful in the intricate talks that preceded the issuance of an export license, indispensable to the trade of war horses. Military goods, whose international commerce was strongly conditioned by state legislation, that favored domestic demand for obvious reasons. Diplomatic negotiations for the procurement of such a strategic commodity could not be simplified to the mere activation of trade circuits in Seville, in Naples, or in Istanbul. On the contrary, the primary and unavoidable objective of horse dealers was to circumvent government constraints, even though these laws merely regarded the imposition of royal licenses and the collection of specific fees, similar to regulations imposed on weapons during the same period. Therefore, the actions of Mantuan diplomacy were primarily directed towards negotiating permits, often so from allies due to the mutual goodwill and ancient friendship. From this viewpoint, then, the 15th century horse trade should be considered indicative of developments in international relations, alongside regular military aid and occasional loans of material. Given the importance of such negotiation, it was imperative to involve representatives fully vested with state authority. In the vast majority of cases, it was the cavalcatori themselves who were personally involved and directly engaged in the negotiations, being preferred over experienced diplomatic personnel because of their expertise in equine matters and their ability to seek out the best specimens, two qualities that had already established them as family members, trusted collaborators of the Marquis. Nevertheless, the primary task of the cavalcatori remained essentially the purchase and exportation of horses. While the practice of entrusting significant missions to individuals outside the political circles was not uncommon in Renaissance Italy, the roles of ambassadors and buyers had to remain distinct even within the Mantuan context. For example, horse dealers did not have the assistance of a chancellor. Instead, they were only accompanied by a handful of soldiers and farriers. Furthermore, such envoys were rarely be tasked with the significant responsibility of gathering information on the countries they visited. Despite being limited and temporary, the task had to be performed with tact. The cavalcatori were expected to behave in a manner befitting servants of a lord of honor, were raised in an extremely polite court. They were also to avoid any scandal, contribute to the construction of an authoritative image of their prince, who would primarily be assessed by the quality of the envoys he sent out. Therefore, it was not a coincidence that many horse dealers were highly esteemed, beloved and much appreciated in various royal palaces, being regarded as individuals with whom kings and courtiers could converse just for pleasure. Besides, the conversation started by horse dealers often had to revolve around equine medicine and equestrian practices, both of which were highly valued topics among all lords of the time. Moreover, it was undeniable that the envoys of the Marquises were indeed great connoisseurs of horses, a knowledge highlighted by the significant value attributed by other Italian princes to the considerable experience of the Mantuan intermediaries. As trainers, users, and buyers of horses, these specialists repeatedly demonstrated their ability to recognize an excellent specimen and realistically assess its characteristics and potential, also demonstrating that they could keep it in shape for weeks or months during exhausting return journeys. However, the skills demanded of them were not solely technical. Especially in the most complex expedition, they had to demonstrate their ability to lead a diverse group of militiamen, stablemen. Additionally, they needed adequate knowledge of foreign languages and good manners, two qualities that a competent servant could utilize effectively in gathering valuable information or in establishing new, extensive networks. Halfway between reliable diplomats and skilled businessmen, The cavalcatori were essentially not to be considered secondary figures in the foreign policy pursued by the lords. Furthermore, they contributed substantially to the supply of the mercenary company owned and commanded by the Marquises of Mantua, enabling men-at-arms to always be well-mounted and to be bought by the pound by any Italian government, as stated by one of the most reputable horse dealers of the Gonzagas. The success and continuity of the missions of such envoys also proved the affluence and prestige of the Lombard court, which was capable of such expenses that even new trade routes could be opened in Albania, Algeria, and Anatolia. That such an investment had become increasingly important in the princely strategies was also confirmed by the recruitment of personnel specifically assigned to foreign purchases, as well as the wealth of correspondence from these experts, more abundant in the Mantuan archives than elsewhere. Sent from Asia, Africa, and Europe, these letters proved the extraordinary mobility of Marquises buyers and their constant presence throughout the Mediterranean area. Together with the numerous colleagues salaried and sponsored by the King of Naples, the Lords of Ferrara, and the Dukes of Milan, the cavalcatori thus constituted a structural component of the 15th century horse market. And certainly, their free circulation would eventually have favored the creation of a common culture of knowledge and languages, of practice and beliefs closely connected to the equestrian world, especially when it came to valuations and prices. The way in which elite horses were evaluated, however, is a different story. But if you are interested in it, you will certainly find answers to your questions in my forthcoming book on the economic policies of horse procurement in Renaissance Italy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fabrizio. That's great, fascinating, and really looking forward to to discussing it with you at greater length, but also to seeing the book in due course. I'm delighted to say that we do have the steel component of Steel and Horseflesh with us today. So we're going to have questions for Fabrizio, but we're going to do them together at the end of the session. So I'd like to introduce our next speaker. We're really delighted that we have with us Per Badia from the University of Barcelona. Per is also an expert on warfare and military history in the late medieval world, but perhaps where Fabrizio is principally interested in the economic sides of things, Per's concentration is on the industrial side of things. So we're delighted to have Per with us, who's going to be talking about an acclaimed industry in Western Europe, the Catalan city of Vic, and its cutlery in the late Middle Ages. So tell us about Swords and Blades, Per.
I would like to thank the Society for Medieval Mediterranean for the opportunity to participate in this scientific forum. My particular contribution will be to present the preliminary findings of my doctoral thesis. As the title of my paper suggests, I will be analyzing the role played by medieval city of Vic and as manufacturers centers specializing in the production of cutlery between 14th and 15th centuries. And to begin with, it is useful to situate the object of the study. My research, as I have said, is focused on the last 2 centuries of the Middle Ages. The sources of this period make it possible to trace the rise and fall of the cutlery industry. On the one hand, there is no doubt that the peak of the economic growth in the industry was in 1385, when the regulation of so-called Officium Culturalium Vici were issued, ratified in 1391, which basically allowed the craft people to impose direct taxes on production. However, by the middle of the 13th century, we find the first signs of a flourishing trade, for example, in such important documents as commercial order to specify the details of the company that intended to send cutlery from Vic to France and Flanders by land, sea, and fresh water. On the other hand, it's possible to place the beginning of decline around the fourth decade of the 15th century. At that time, the city council warned of the great ruin that the industry had suffered. The most important, they insist, until then. After this municipal plenary session, we find new problems such as the rivalry for professional interference around 1449, or later, in 1460, with new attempts to reform the regulations of the trade. Having established the chronological framework of my research, I thought it's appropriate to define the territorial context most likely to have been closely linked to the emergence of a cutlery center in the city of Vic. As can you see in the map, Vic is located in the center of Catalonia on a north-south axis that runs from the market towns of the Pyrenees to Barcelona on the shores of the Mediterranean. The question is, the rapid supply of iron from the iron and steel region of the Eastern Pyrenees and the procurement of steel for international trade through the Barcelona market was facilitated by the privileged location. It's important to note the city location on the main trade routes that link the interior markets of Catalonia and Aragon. The sites, in fact, the size of the portico square that houses the city market, now as the Mercadal, indicates the commercial dynamism of these people. The big cutlery industry in particular, and the Catalan cutlery in general, have up the four different production. The big cutlery industry in particular and the Catalan cutlery in general have up to four different production lines. The first problem is that they are described by the term coltelleria. It is the only when some of their characteristics are highlighted for commercial lucrative purpose that they can be distinguished. The first groups are war knife, identified as cutting weapons. We have, for example, a little known term that has not been mentioned before, the nickname marsols or marsols, which clearly alludes to the martial. Other elements that could be used to classify the knives as war cutlers are the grandiose. When the sources speak of long knives, and especially when the expression cultells mes de mida appears, they were more than 1.5 meters long. Finally, we must mention the so-called esbaits in Vic and the esbaidura in the Saragossa regulations. But words come from the Latin evadire, to flee. They were blades with a curved tip designed to deflect other offensive weapons. The second group will be the dagger. All types of daggers were made. Also, this type of production was absorbed by the city cutlery industry. It must be said that the foreign community of specialized daggers was established in the Crown of Aragon. This group not settled in Vic until, the 15th century. Also, they had been in Barcelona since the beginning of the 15th century. They carry out their activity in parallel with the rest of the population of the sector, without established family or neighborhood ties. They were mainly artisans from the Kingdom of France and were born in the context of the 100-Year War. Some of these most important prominent members, such as a certain like Gionnet, entered to the service of the court of the King of Aragon, for example. A third group called cutlery used for the specific trade after the war cultelle. We find a reference to the trade which they were associated butchers, for example, tailors, osier makers' knives, to name but a few. Finally, the fourth group of knives, known as ganivets, leave the context of warfare and enters to the realm of domestic use and cutlery. Okay, symptomatic. The following The following is a summary analysis of the techniques involved in the manufacture of cocktails in the town of Vic. The first phase, perhaps the best known as most studied, was the forging of the blade. The craftsmen who mastered this technique were called couturiers. These same iron workers had the knowledge to carry out the remaining stage until the blade was completely finished. However, many of them were only blacksmiths in the strict sense of the word, as lack of space or capital prevented them from going any further. This gave rise to the phenomena of subcontracting, either between couturiers or by craftsmen specializing in sharpening, rubbing, and polishing cutler blades. The last of this technical process, the polishing of the blade, was an intermediate stage that's contested by couturiers themselves, the repasadors, and the cutler gilders, depending on the tools they call for and their workshops. According to the notarial contract from the 14th and 15th century for Vic, the previous steps in the fixing of cutlery blades was to file the surface of the object to be decorated. Since the slightest crack or roughness caused there, the steel or caused it to be incorrectly fixed. It seems likely that the word repasar in Catalan text refers to the polishing operation which aimed to fix and polish the metal sheets. Finally, there is the phase known as gilding, which refers to application of gold leaf to the handle, silver leaf to the iron, and steel blades and tin leaf to the other metallic elements of the cutler. Parallel to the techniques linked to the iron part of the knife, an equally important group of craftsmen dedicated to working the handless emerged. I will highlight the one in charge of transforming wood horns into partial working handlers. There was also an attempt on the part of the knife gilders to control the face of blades heel. Okay. After presenting the production context, I will give the figures that I have been able to extract from medium and large scale trade documentation, in particular from the records of trade in private products, as well as from maritime orders and insurance. It is in these trade sources that it is possible to distinguish between common cutlery and the only one that is identified, but in industrial origin. I'm sorry. It is worth highlighting the commercial penetration of Vic towards the fairs of market of Aragon in a feudal cycle that lasted part of the summer months and continued until the beginning of September. In terms of maritime transport, cutlery for Vic was distributed along the main shipping routes, with the exception of Sardinia. The main market for cutlery was, as can be seen, Sicily. However, if we only analyze the economic aspect of the exports, we can see that Vic played a relatively minor role. The figures for the sport need qualification. For instance, it should be noted that significant towns in Catalonia directly purchase from Vic. As shown in the list of the trade and in the cutler sector, this is a predominance of the cutler sheet manufacturers. The commercial success of the cutler gilders and limited importance of the big sheet makers can be attributed to the fact that the gilders sold knives with the handless to artisan traders from abroad. These traders then added the sheet to the knife and sold it as if it were not from Vic. So, the documentation has also allowed us to discover until, okay, more aspects about the mark of the products, and the export from the period 1885 and 1438. And I introduced this. Okay. I'm sorry. I have a problem with. Okay, the documentation has also allowed us to discover authentic lines of wealthy craftsmen who become merchants without abandoning the knife trade, as was the case with Ramon Uselló, as we can see or his daughter were related to the economic elite of the culinary trade. And finally, as the economy associated with the sector grew, we can see the deep hierarchy within the collective. In a local context, at the base of the pyramidal system with the artisans who gave their labor in exchange for a wage. They even had to pay for the means of production and the hammers and anvils, for example. It was here that the first tendency towards the concentration of resources and capital began to emerge. At the regional level, we find the intermediary with the raw materials, and finally, the internal sphere was reserved for those who control the export and trade channel. And this is all for my part. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to both Per and Fabrizio for their really, really interesting introductions to their research. While people are gathering their thoughts, I thought I might take chair's privilege to start with a question. So I wondered if I might ask about some of the details in the sources you're both looking at. I thought these papers marched together really, really well in terms of thinking about how goods or animals, I suppose, in Fabrizio's case, are moving around and are being exchanged, evaluated, sold. And I wondered if you could say a bit more about how these items of commerce, for want of a better term, are being described in your sources. So, for instance, Per, you said that one thing that struck me in your presentation was the level of detail that's used to describe the people involved in the production process. But it seemed that a lot of the categories for how these edged weapons are being sold is just these are knives from Vic, right? Is there any more specificity that comes in the sources? Are we seeing descriptions in the sources of how these blades are being made in comparison with other blades to differentiate them when they're on the market? Or is the toponym that they come from Vic enough to satisfy a potential buyer? And likewise, Fabrizio, do we have any indication in your sources of how the horses themselves are being described when they're being exchanged? And if so, does that tell us anything, or in both cases, does it tell us anything about what buyers are looking for? I mean, in the case of horses, particular conformation, particular colors, particular, in the case of swords, I mean, there are particular aspects. I mean, I'm thinking of sort of Damascene steel and how you can tell from the sword how it's been made. Do we have anything like that in the Catalan context? So if both of you may, perhaps if we start with Fabrizio and then Per, if you could just comment on how these items are being described when they're put onto market and what particular traits, I suppose, sellers are advertising and buyers might be looking for.
Sometimes the sources not specified if it are daggers, puñals, coultails, or other types. In several times, the context it's rich in terms and it's possible, but other time not. It depends.
What sort of traits are they advertising? Is it just the length of the? I mean, is there anything about the actual forging process, or is it just about the physical description of, say, the length or the type of weapon?
It is the forging process and in description in the market, another context, another mercantile context.
Okay. Fabrizio, do you want to come in on horses?
Yeah, of course. Well, I used mostly state correspondence in the case of Mantua and envoys. So this state correspondence is mostly about as for physical characteristic of the horses. They are describing the age, for example, of the horse, not the coat, but the coat is well described in other kind of sources, which are Hippiatric treatises. So use mostly a combination of these different sources. So we have the state accounts, we have these Hippiatric treatises, So this highlights the, how to call it, the standard for the evaluation of these horses. Of course, there are colors that are more preferred, such as the chestnut one. I can't remember the name, the bay one probably. So we have a preference also for the age, because foals were preferred because they cost less, they're less expensive than the stallions, for example, for well-trained respect to well-trained horse. So this is another characteristic that is very interesting for the Marquises of Mantua. Also because probably these foals were not trained according to the Italian and Mantuan specifically tradition. So they were looking something that can be trained in a very proper Mantuan way.
Yeah, so just to follow up on that very quickly, you're talking about the preference for a chestnut coat. Is that specific to Mantua, or does that seem to be a wider preference?
I think it's a very wider preference. Even in Naples, we have this preference for this color, but one of the Marquises of Mantua, Francis II, made very specific comment about his distaste for a color, which is the gray one, if I remember correctly. So, okay. But there are other monarchs that say, I prefer this color or not, but they don't explain, they didn't explain why. So
I wondered if it had something to do with
a matter of personal preference, probably.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I wondered if it had anything to do with perhaps an attempt to create a kind of core of uniform colored horses so they're recognizable.
No, I don't think so. But I mean, it also depends how the genetics work. So I think one of the King Ferrante of Aragon of Naples said, "I don't care about the color. The important thing is that the horse works, and it's very good war horse." And we have also one of these authors, this Patrick Test, that he said, I don't believe in this kind of thing. It's like sorceress, but the market is cares a lot about this characteristics. So it's just not something that it's real, it's true, but it's something that buyers and vendors discussed when they negotiated the price. So we have this very important, I think, this characteristic of more market than culture. So
right. Fascinating. So Jörg Gassman has a question that builds on that about not about color but about conformation. So Jörg asks whether Mantua had any standard regarding horse height or conformation. So are they looking, for instance, for short backs, long backs, anything else about conformation that seems to be standardized, or is
the fact that they just into this fact, but they don't describe this height. So they say, for example, there is an horse that is as much tall as another specimen. But yeah, there is this important question. I mean, they also cared about their physical conformation, if their bones were strong enough to support the weight of a full armored knight. So yeah, there is this aspects, but they are not well described, at least in the sources that I have read. Not really in the Patrick Treatises too. So it's just a generic explanation of the perfect conformation of a horse, but there is not this thorough specific description, these physical characteristics.
And if I understand you correctly, you're saying this is sort of general ideal rather than one specific to Mantua.
Yeah, but the fact that it's so widespread is probably it reveals that it was a standard for war horses, an ideal standard for war horses. But of course, another important 16th century treatises say the important thing is this war. The ideal world, we can find all the horses we want, but in the actual world, we could also appreciate a horse which is not perfect. So just appreciate the fact that the horse is fine.
It works, yes. Thank you. So John McAllister has a question for Per. He wondered if you might say a little bit more about the crisis of 1438, which you mentioned in your talk. Could you say a little bit more about what were some of the factors that motivated the crisis in 1438?
Yeah. The question of the great disaster of 1438 and the decline of the industry has, in my opinion, many factors to be analyzed. The most obvious is that the families that had dominate the industry began to disappear from the records. In addition, the knife makers of the time were extremely impoverished compared to the number of the anterior population. The number of the years they had been in the business. The French, for other part, the French dagger makers came in, as I said, and eventually merged with the few survivors of the previous craft tradition. I think the factors are a decline in demand for war cutlery and increase in cheap swords alongside the daggers. In this context, I believe that that other craftsmen and merchants outside the sector are gradually gaining market share. Another issue to bear in mind is that during the first years of our study, it is possible to some of the cutlery was diverted to the Islamic kingdoms of North Africa or even to Granada. This smuggling seems to have been carried out by Barcelona silversmiths and big knife gilders. For example, in 1430 asked the thing to open trade with the forbidden territories, forbidden Islamic territories. It's the question that I think that
Sorry, I forgot to unmute myself. Jörg has another question, also for Per, about, and I think it follows on from your discussion of the wider context of 1438, but may transcend it as well, which is wondering about how the smiths in Vic were organized. So was there a guild system, or is it just people independent? Could you say a little bit more about how workers are organized?
Exists a duality. For one hand, exists the corporation, that's its officium culturarium vici, with a question, mercant question, commercial, economic questions. And for the other part, the confraternity of San Elogi et San Honorati, that just treat questions about ceremonial questions, religious questions, are two separated. San Elogi and San Honorat, and not Iram in the question economic questions, neither other business.
Right. Okay.
Okay.
So Emmanuel Buttigieg has a question. First of all, he says thank you very much for two wonderful talks. But he wondered how much information there is about the logistics. So what we're talking about in both of your contexts is trans-Mediterranean trade over very, very long distances, usually by sea, which presents perhaps more problems for horse transport than for edged weapons. But he wondered, getting these items from one place to another, and particularly about the horses, how do they manage to ensure that the steel doesn't rust, that the horses don't get sick, that you can get your goods from one place to another with a certain degree of reliability? So perhaps Fabrizio first, and then Per.
Yeah, of course, the question of logistics was very important, especially because horses were considered to be very fragile items. So this is why, for example, Italian merchants didn't want to trade in horses. So there are specific indications about this in some very important chronicles or registers of Italian merchants. The horses were not mentioned in merchants' handbooks, for example. So merchants didn't want to do this, but cavalcatori, of course, have to deal with this problem. So they, for example, decided to avoid completely ships, for example. They prefer to trade by land. But of course, this was a very expensive and it required some effort to be carried out this effort, because even from Neapolitan account books we read that conducting, for example, 30 horses from the deepest south of Calabria to the capital Naples, it required hundreds and hundreds of ducats, for example. So it was really expensive. So in this case, we have these travels from Barcelona to Mantua by land, which are very long, very lengthy, very tiresome. They run into many difficulties, so they had to pay tolls or duties, or the King of France wants to steal their horses. So it was very difficult. And the few accounts about these travels by ship are full of reference to that, to saints that were prayed, or just many difficulties, or the horses that were sick, or they were captured by pirates too. So yeah, they actually prefer to travel by land. But this is a very important question, especially because Spanish trader, Catalan trader, exported a lot of horses from Sardinia, for example. So I didn't study this kind of trade, but probably we have to compare these two attitudes toward the export of horses.
Yes, it's a bit difficult to transport horses by land from Sardinia.
No.
No, but that's fascinating, because it tells us something about how the level of anxiety around sea travel, if they'd rather send their horses over the Pyrenees, through France, over the Alps into Italy. I mean, that's and it's, I imagine it's a bit like with the analogy today with a car, where you're putting a lot of miles on the car just getting it from one place to another. The horses are going to go through a lot of wear and tear just to. And that's remarkable. Peter, do you have any thoughts about transporting edged weapons from one place to another? Are there similar concerns about sea travel, or it's a very different type of commerce, but in terms of the logistics of getting the blades from Catalonia to the destinations, are there any ways in which that anxieties around that manifest in the sources?
Yes, the sources specified the type of travel, the logistic, the beast that used for these enterprises, and the containers, containers that the cutlery was transported in this period, but not specified in the animals, not always.
Are there any indications that they have to take precautions to prevent things like rust, or particularly traveling by sea? Are there concerns about oxidization and rust contaminating the blades, or is that pretty invisible in the sources?
It's invisible in the sources. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Great. So then we have a question from Bogdan Smarandake. Apologies if I've mispronounced that. Bogdan also says, thank you very much for your presentations. He has a question for Fabrizio. He's wondering if the cavalcatori ever ran into problems procuring horses. So are there embargoes or shortages during times of war? And he says that his impression is that we usually hear about embargoes on the transport of war materials going east, but not so much going west. And have you found any problems around either supply or demand obstacles, challenges that produce friction into the market there?
Yeah, more than embargoes, I would rather speak of state control of these markets. So this is a very incredibly important aspects of the trade in any strategic materials in the Middle Ages. So this applied to horses, it's applied to saltpeter, it's applied to not gunpowder, bombards or stuff like that. So yeah, there is this state control, but it's not too tight. So as I said in my presentation, it can be easily circumvented. So they just ask this license, relying on this goodwill and friendship and alliances and stuff like that. So they manage to export this kind of thing. But the problem of shortages is another important aspect of this market. You see this in Spain, you see this in Milan, because when there is war, the state, the prince, of course, privileged his own consumption of war material. So even in the nearest markets, there is this kind of shortage. Of course, we have also these laws that prohibited the export during war, but you can also see this in Mantua too. So yeah, there is this serious concern about the limitation of the trade. So yeah, this is, as I said, a very, very important aspect of the trade. All my book revolves around this topic of the political economy of warhorse procurement.
And so when you talk about the state control, is the state's attitude towards the trade in horses more or less comparable with its attitude towards, as you say, saltpeter, iron, lumber, other war material? Or are horses dealt with separately, or is it all just sort of lumped together in terms of this is just war material and we deal with it all the same?
They dealt with it all the same, but horses are this very peculiar thing that they were considered as a patrimony, as a home patrimony of the prince. So all the laws, all the kind of regulations seems to be related to this kind of patrimonial attitude of the prince toward horses. So the horses are owned. All the horses of the kingdom are owned by the king. So he can request it to his subject, he can request it to traders, he can prohibit the trade. So this is another important aspect that probably relates to the wider consideration on what the king can do with his own subject. But of course, you have also this problem with mineral rights or stuff like that. So I didn't investigate this problem thoroughly, but there is this sensation that this problem are more related not just to the trade, but this monarch king's property.
That's really quite wide royal remit in terms of eminent domain. So is that specific to is that specific to Italy, or is that widespread in the 15th century, that it's just assumed that the kings
mostly compared with Spain, so because also this is relation between the Aragonese Commonwealth, but yeah, it seems that it's widespread in all Europe.
Right. Wow.
At least in Mediterranean Europe.
For the purpose of the recording, let's just say a big thank you to both Fabrizio and Per for two really interesting papers and some really stimulating discussion afterwards. I've learned a great deal, and I'm sure everyone else has as well. So thank you both very, very much.
Thank you. And thank you, Gregory, as well, for chairing this session. And before we stop the recording, just a big thank you also from the Wolf and from the Society for the Medieval Mediterranean to our fantastic speakers, to our chair, and also to everyone who has attended this session. So see you soon, and thank you everyone for attending.